My name is Colin Kahl. I'm the Social Science Co-Director at the Center for International Security and Cooperation, and I'm also a Senior Fellow here at CSAC FSI. So today's event is looking back at the legacy of the 41st President of the United States, George Herbert Walker Bush. Obviously, Bush passed away on November 30th, and there's been a lot of retrospectives over the last week, but we have three great folks to talk about that legacy here today. Although George H.W. Bush only served one term as president, I think it's essentially objectively true that he will go down as one of the most consequential foreign policy presidents of our republic, even though he was only 4 years in office. He oversaw the peaceful end of the Cold War, which in and of itself would be legacy defining, but he also set the conditions for the peaceful reunification of Germany, which was a big deal. His administration, he was the architect of the Gulf War, which in addition to kind of demonstrating kind of unrivaled US military prowess, also broke, for better or worse, broke the Vietnam syndrome as it related to how the United States wielded its military around the world. And it put Iraq at the center of US foreign policy in the post-Cold War world. And if you doubt that statement, consider that every president since George H.W. Bush has fought a war inside Iraq. So it clearly was important to somebody. And of course, his administration intervened in both Panama and Somalia, smaller scale interventions that in many ways set the stage for the types of interventions that would be typical of the United States in the immediate post-Cold War period. So there's many other things I'm sure we'll talk about today, but I look forward to the conversation. With us to talk about George H.W. Bush's legacy in foreign policy and national security affairs are three amazing folks here at CSAC. I think David Holloway is going to speak first. David will, as all of you know, recently retired from the history department, has been with CSAC for a long time as a senior fellow. Then after David, Sig Hecker, who's also a senior fellow here at FSI and CSAC. And then Martha Crenshaw, who is also a senior fellow here at FSI and CSAC, will give their thoughts. So David, without further ado.
Right, thank you very much. We've heard a great deal in the last week or so about George H.W. Bush's role in foreign policy and in national security and in kind of presiding over the end of the Cold War. I want to read a quotation from Adam Michnik, a very well-known Polish figure who was involved in the opposition movement in the roundtable talks that led to the first non-communist government in Poland, and is still active as an editor and a public intellectual in Poland. And I'm going to quote him now. "Whenever I happen to consider that topic, why communism failed, I know that in Washington, everybody is sure that communism failed as a result of the American policy. How else? Whenever I'm in the Vatican, it seems perfectly clear that communism fell as a result of the activities of the Apostolic See and John Paul II, our Pope. Whenever I am in Asia, I have no doubts that communism was lost in Afghanistan. That is just where the Soviet Union broke its teeth. And whenever I'm in Moscow, it's absolutely obvious to me that communism was toppled by Russians, the only thing that remains unclear being whether it was by Gorbachev or Yeltsin. And finally, we Poles know and are convinced that it was we who toppled communism and that the world received freedom from communism from us as a gift." The reason I like that is not to, first of all, I think it's very nicely put, but just that these phenomena are very complex phenomena, and we have focused in the last week on the American president's role in all of this. But what happened in the 4 years of the Bush administration was something really quite complicated, in which, of course, the US played an important role, and President Bush in particular played an important role, but there were other factors going on. So the first point I wanted to make is that Bush was certainly not a straight continuation of the Reagan's policy. In fact, the Bush administration took a pause, did a reassessment of policy, made clear, I think, quite a lot of criticism of what Reagan had done, criticized the INF agreement, thought that Schultz had been willing to give away too much. And some of you in the room will remember, at least I remember my own part, a sense of puzzlement. What's going on? Why this kind of pulling back on the process that seemed to be underway at the time? Especially when you consider that one of Gorbachev's major speeches was his speech to the United Nations in December 1988, promising a major reduction in Soviet forces in Eastern Europe. So why this pulling back? I think it reflected views in Bush's team. Scowcroft and Robert Gates were skeptical about the possibility of real change in the Soviet Union. And I think President Bush himself was a cautious man, prudent, you might say, and therefore wanted some kind of reassessment. But one consequence of that is that the events that took place in late 1989 in Eastern Europe, especially, the formation of a non-communist government in Poland, the overturning of communist rule in Hungary and in Czechoslovakia, and then, of course, most notably, the opening of the wall in Berlin in November 1989. I think these were not events controlled from Washington, and in fact, in some sense, came as a surprise and a challenge. And in particular, the opening of the wall came as a challenge because that opened up the possibility of the reunification of Germany. And there, I think, the Bush administration played a very important role. Helmut Kohl, I think, conducted the policy in a very able fashion to move towards the reunification of Germany and to do it quickly before it could get caught up in other issues. President Bush backed him on that and I think gave a great deal of help. That kind of Kohl-Bush alliance was crucial in seeing through the reunification of Germany, and in particular the reunification of Germany within NATO. And that, I think, was one of the great achievements of the Bush administration. That was an extremely important issue for European security. It was an extremely contentious issue also, indeed with the Soviet Union. But nevertheless, I think the policy was carried through in a very skillful way, leading to reunification in October 1990, so less than a year after the breaching of the wall. And of course, the wall was opening of the wall was a total accident, where one of the members of the East German Politburo had misunderstood some communication he was given and announced on television that the wall would now be open. And it was too late to stop it when people started streaming through. So one of the issues then is, what about European security, a new order in Europe? And in December 1989, Jim Baker, who's of course Bush's Secretary of State, talked about a new architecture for a new Europe. Germany reunified, NATO transformed, CSCE more effective, the European community strengthened. But I think the key driving points in the policy were to maintain a US presence in Europe, which could be done through keeping NATO, and also extending Western institutions eastward. So at least potentially, of course, European community. NATO, that option was left open in an ambiguous way, which at least causes still a matter of controversy, what was promised at the time to Gorbachev by way of enlarging NATO or not enlarging NATO. But that was the vision of the new architecture. And so when Gorbachev objected and said, well, we need to be part of NATO too, Bush wouldn't have any of that. Or when there was talk about a common European home, admittedly a rather vague concept on Gorbachev's part, again, the US wasn't interested. The important thing was NATO. That was what kept the United States in NATO. So I think one of the consequences, it's not an intentional consequence, but one of the consequences you could say, at least, is that European security is a fraught issue today. In relation, we did not manage to create a system in which Russia would feel a part and play a normal role. Now, whether that could have been done is another issue. I'm just saying that's not an issue that was resolved. The second aspect of the Bush administration's policy was basically not to give economic help to Gorbachev. And that was, I think, if you look at, Gorbachev made various requests and Bush turned them down. And Bill Taubman, in his biography of Gorbachev, raises the issue, of whether or not more aid to Gorbachev at an earlier stage would have helped him stay in power for longer. I mean, I think it's a highly debatable proposition, given the state of Russian politics at the time. But there were voices raised. Maggie Thatcher, although this is after she was out of government in the summer of 1991, explained to, or told Jack Matlock to pass on the message to George Bush that, you know, if the West doesn't help Gorbachev now come to his aid, history won't forgive it. A further point I'd like to make is that we heard a good deal over the last week or so about George Bush's civility, the lack of threatening language used towards others, and indeed in many instances during the events in his administration, where he told people, don't gloat, don't boast, you know, please don't offend the Soviet Union, don't offend Gorbachev by, you know, saying we have won. The internal language in discussions was somewhat different. It was, and I'll quote just one example. This is Bush to Helmut Kohl in February 1990, when the issue was raised about whether to accommodate some Soviet wishes with regard to the reunification of Germany, where Bush says, to hell with that, we prevailed and they didn't. We can't let the Soviets clutch victory from the jaws of defeat. So I'm saying that not as a criticism, because you might say, no, of course he had to conduct a tough policy. And he was able to keep the kind of private calculations different from the public diplomacy. But I think what it does illustrate is that we shouldn't take the mild public language as any expression of a wimp factor, to use a term that was used about the president at the time, because this was quite, I think, a calculated look at what America's interests were in Europe, to keep NATO, to be in NATO, to have Germany reunified in NATO. And so I think that the policy with regard to the Soviet Union, regard to Russia, was a policy of, yes, of help, of cooperation. After the initial pause, I mean, the first summit meeting was in Malta in December 1989. The policy was one that was very much geared towards the idea that the Cold War was over and the United States had won. And although Bush, as I mentioned, often had warned against gloating, let me quote his State of the Union address in 1992. By the grace of God, America won the Cold War. A world once divided into two armed camps, now recognizes one sole and preeminent power, the United States of America, and this they regard with no dread, for the world trusts us with power, and the world is right. They trust us to be fair and restrained. They trust us to be on the side of decency. They trust us to do what is right. In a way, that's the major kind of legacy. How we've treated the legacy is another issue for debate. So it seems to me there are two interesting, or lots of interesting questions, but two questions that come. As I say, I think the reunification of Germany was a great achievement. Was there a possibility of helping Gorbachev economically in a way that would secure a less painful transition from the Soviet Union to Russia, and either economically or indeed politically? And second is, could a better arrangement have been worked out at that time for European security or not? Right, thank you.
Well, thank you, David. David has done a very nice job of sort of giving you the big picture of what happened in Europe and Russia. What I want to do is just tell you personal stories. Since the presidency of George W. Bush and my directorship at Los Alamos overlapped. And so there were quite a few moments when the things that were done in the Bush had a dramatic effect on the labs and on me. I became director at Los Alamos in January of 1986. In October, Reagan and Gorbachev got together and said, hey, at Reykjavik, let's get rid of nuclear weapons. My first impression was, how's that for job security? Now, it turns out they didn't quite get rid of nuclear weapons. However, they did sign the INF Treaty, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the next year. And then importantly, from my perspective, in 1988, they had agreed that they would try to do something to actually be able to ratify the Threshold Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. That was signed in 1974 and never ratified. And so the idea was to actually carry out reciprocal nuclear tests at each other's test site and have the other party, that is either the Soviets or the Americans, monitor the test with on-site inspection to be able to then get enough confidence in seismic measurements to be able to ratify the Threshold Test Ban Treaty. So that's when I first actually met the Soviets out in Nevada, when we did a test of a Los Alamos device at the Nevada test site with the Soviets there doing their measurements of what we call cortex to get on-site measurements. And it was really at that time that my life changed immensely, because once I met the Soviet scientists, I realized how much we were alike. And actually we started pushing at that time, based mostly on what the Soviets were telling us, is to say, hey, look, let's get together. We have common nuclear problems. And so they were trying to push for exchange visits to each other's laboratories. However, what happened in the meantime, before we were able to pull that off, on July 31st of 1991, it was then George H.W. Bush and Gorbachev who signed the START Treaty. So that was July 1st. Only a few weeks later, this August 19th to 21st, there was the attempted coup of Gorbachev while he was in his dacha down at the Crimea. And those 3 days really changed the world profoundly, and particularly they really got the attention of George H.W. Bush, who indeed had carried out his reevaluation of the strategy and eventually led to what we now call the presidential nuclear initiatives. But lots of people in the United States really got the essence that we were now in serious danger. People like Sam Nunn, for example, and a lot of the NGO community, including people here at Stanford at that time. And so when Gorbachev was eventually released, eventually one found out that he had lost the controls for the launch controls for the nuclear weapons. On September 27th, in the morning, George H.W. Bush called up Gorbachev. And for those of you who are interested, I sort of wrote up the conversation because it's now declassified, where he says, "Mikhail, how are you?" And Mikhail says, "George, fine, thank you." He says, "I got your letter and I very much want to talk." And indeed they talked, because what Bush proposed at the time, he said, "I'm going to take unilateral measures to take a number and class of our nuclear weapons out of service." And in the end, what he was trying to tell Gorbachev is, look, I'm going to do this unilaterally, but I'd certainly appreciate you considering that. And on October 5th, it turns out Gorbachev went on Soviet national television and announced that he would reciprocate. Then the next few months' time were particularly perilous time in that Gorbachev, even though he was allowed to come back from the Crimea, his days were numbered, as were those of the Soviet Union. And these were the days when then the cooperative threat reduction program, the so-called non-Lugar program, was essentially born. And again, there were people like Bill Perry from here, Ash Carter from Harvard, who played a significant role. And then Bush signed into legislation the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program on December 12th of 1991. And it was 4 days later that turns out we had a meeting in Washington, the lab directors from the Department of Energy labs, with Admiral Watkins, who was Secretary of Energy. And he had just come back from a cabinet meeting with President Bush. And President Bush said, look, I'm really concerned about the potential brain drain as he saw the Soviet Union coming apart. What can we do about it? So Watkins asked us that question, and it turns out ever since Nevada test site of 1988, I've been trying to push our government into allowing us to actually go visit each other so that we could get to know and get to know each other and see what we could do to mount an effort for the new common dangers. And so when I told Watkins, I said, look, I've been trying to get your administration to go ahead and let us go. And he said, so why don't you? Because I said, look, the best way to find out how to avoid the brain drain is go ask them, ask their lab directors. If this was happening at my laboratory, I'd have some ideas. And Watkins said, why don't you go? Before Christmas. This was December 16th. I said, I don't want to go that badly. But on February 23rd, John Knuckles, who was director at Lawrence Livermore at that time, and I went to their secret cities in what we now call Sarov and Snezhinsk. And that effort started a joint effort that we call lab-to-lab cooperation that I recently wrote up with help of the Russians and the Americans in a 1,000-page book as to how we deal with what we call the 4 loose nuke problems: loose weapons, loose materials, loose people, and loose exports. And indeed, I think it was one of the most successful cooperative programs carried out over 25 years or so. The next direct interaction with George H.W. Bush was related to nuclear testing. And that is those reciprocal tests that we did and the various technologies that we had developed and demonstrated for being able to actually monitor nuclear testing did lead to the signing of the Threshold Test Ban Treaty in December of 1990. But then in August of 1992, this was now at a time after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a lot of enthusiasm in Washington for a comprehensive nuclear test ban. And there was actually a test ban moratorium legislation in August that Bush, in his usual cautious fashion, did not support. But on October 2nd, he actually signed legislation of the so-called Hatfield Amendment that said the US would have a moratorium on nuclear testing in preparation for a CTBT in 1996, but that it would allow for 15 additional tests before the 1996 timeframe. It was actually to divide them up appropriately, 6 for Los Alamos, 6 for Livermore, and 3 for the UK, because we actually, the United Kingdom did its nuclear tests at the Nevada test site. Well, it turns out, as you know, he was a one-term president, and in '93, Clinton administration came in. They opposed that particular idea of having 15 more tests. There were no more tests. And that was a dramatic change then for Los Alamos and Lawrence Livermore Laboratory as we transitioned from the era where we used to design, test, and field nuclear weapons to no more testing. And so that was the birth of stockpile stewardship as such. I can't help but think as we look back now as to whether it wouldn't have been wiser to do some number of nuclear tests yet before the comprehensive test ban, because that's exactly what the French did. And the French not only signed, but the French also ratified the comprehensive test ban. Clinton signed it in September of 1996, but the Senate defeated it, or did not approve, did not ratify in October of 1999. So I have a couple of more stories, but I want to make sure to turn it over to Martha. One is that he also had a significant impact on North-South Korea in that September 27th phone call, the decision he made to take the tactical nuclear weapons, either sea-delivered or land-based tactical weapons, out of the system, and therefore take the nuclear weapons out of South Korea. That had a significant impact, led to a North-South joint statement, the first one that actually promised denuclearization, that was signed in January of 1992. We had some technical activities related to the Gulf War, but I'll talk about those when we get a chance in Q's and A's. Martha?
Well, thank you. I may not be the best person to talk about all this because David Holloway makes me recall that on the eve of all these developments, I very confidently predicted to my class in international relations that Germany would never be reunified, that the U.S. and the Soviet Union would never permit it. So much for that. So my task today is to talk about the Persian Gulf War. And as Colin said, it was regarded generally as a very impressive success for the United States, for the military certainly. I recall very well that when we went into the war, there were skeptics who said that Iraq had a very experienced army. They had just fought Iran for 8 years. They were experienced at combat in the desert, which we were not. We were still thinking about Europe. It was going to be really a difficult task, and of course, in the end, it wasn't that difficult at all. It was very short, with very low casualties on the coalition side. Politically, Bush assembled a very impressive coalition against Saddam Hussein. It contained major Arab states, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, even Syria. So all in all, it was quite an impressive feat. And it was to Bush's credit that he stuck to his guns. He went to Congress and said quite clearly in September of 1990, actually, up to the present, that Iraq would not be permitted to annex Kuwait, and that's not a threat, it's not a boast, it's just the way it's going to be. Out of these troubled times, a new world order can emerge, a new era, freer from the threat of terror, not free, freer, stronger in the pursuit of justice, and more secure in the quest for peace. He got approval from a Democratic Congress. They approved a joint resolution to support the use of force. There was UN approval for the mission. But some people looking at the victory noticed some drawbacks. There were some criticisms, and an initial criticism was that the war didn't need to happen in the first place. There was a lot of criticism of the fact that Saddam Hussein had had a conversation with the American ambassador. Does anybody remember the name? April Glaspie, Ambassador Glaspie, in which he, Saddam Hussein, said he was given the green light to invade Kuwait. She said, oh, no, that never came up. And she had gone home on vacation at the time of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. She never went back, by the way. It, of course, ruined her career. But many people said it was not her fault. She was unfairly blamed for sending the wrong signal, for not deterring Saddam Hussein. And the problem had been the whole administration's policy, which up to that point had been pretty sympathetic to Iraq. And I think most of us remember that during the Iran-Iraq War, we very much took the side of Iraq. So many people felt that it was a policy failure that set the stage for the invasion in the first place. So that was a problem. Then there was the question of, should we have gone further at the time? Should we have gone further than simply expelling Iraq from Kuwait? Should we have removed Saddam Hussein from power at that time? That question, of course, came back to haunt us after 2001 and in 2003. Many people accused the second President Bush of trying to complete the mission left incomplete by his father in not removing Saddam Hussein from power. At the time, though, there was certainly, I don't think, any sympathy within the ranks of the administration for removing Saddam Hussein. All the generals, all of Bush's advisors pretty much felt that the general Pottery Barn doctrine, if you broke it, I think that it was General Schwarzkopf who said we'd be like the dinosaur in a tar pit. We would be stuck there forever, and that we should never have done it. So there were definitely not a sentiment for doing it at the time. I would say that it came later that we had some second guessing on that score. One thing we did, of course, in addition to expelling the Iraqi forces, however, was to establish a no-fly zone that covered the Kurds in the north and the Shia in the south. But at the same time, we had encouraged the Shia in Iraq to rise up against Saddam Hussein, and when they did, we did not support them. So there was widespread bloodshed and distrust for the United States that lingered on for years because of what was regarded generally in the Middle East as encouragement for a revolt. And then when the time came, 0 hour, we were unwilling to support the Shia in the south. These, of course, are the groups that are now in charge of the government in Iraq, and their suspiciousness of the U.S. Dates very much from this time. Now, establishing a no-fly zone in the north permitted the Kurds to establish the kind of autonomy that they have now, at least created the sort of facilitating conditions for what we see now in terms of Kurdish autonomy, which is a mixed blessing. It has its pros and its cons in terms of political developments in the Middle East. Another consequence of the no-fly zone was that we needed to station troops in Saudi Arabia for a long time, because when Iraq initially invaded Kuwait, our fear and the Saudi fear was that they would just keep going and that they wouldn't stop with the oil fields in Kuwait. They said Kuwait, in effect, owed them money for having defended everybody in the fight against Iran, putting it simply. And there was great fear that they would just keep going and go straight into Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia invited the United States to send troops, and at the height of the war, there were over 500,000 troops stationed in Saudi Arabia. So once we've expelled Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, there's no more need, except there is a need for some troops to enforce a no-fly zone, so troops stayed. Now, they're there, and they arrive there just at the moment that Osama bin Laden returns to Saudi Arabia from Afghanistan and Pakistan, in his view, having defeated the Soviet Union, driven them out of Afghanistan, and indeed contributed to the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, from his own point of view. Apparently, according to Larry Wright in his book, The Looming Tower, bin Laden went directly to the king, because the bin Ladens were a very prominent family, and said, "You don't need American troops to protect you from Iraq. We, the Mujahideen, will protect you." And according to Larry's story, they were laughed at. And this offended bin Laden greatly, and as we all know, American troops in Saudi Arabia, in the Saudi holy places, the holiest places in Islam, was a great offense to him. And you know what's interesting was that it was on September the 11th that Bush went to Congress to ask for the resolution to support the war. And exactly 11 years later, a certain number of years later, I think it's about 11, you have the bin Laden's attack. Now that's pure coincidence, I'm convinced, but it's sort of interesting when you look at the date. So it set the stage for this. But another series of developments that the war also set the stage for had to do with the Palestinians and the Israelis. Now, almost all the Arab states supported the coalition against Saddam Hussein in Iraq, which was an amazing thing. However, Jordan supported Iraq, Algeria supported Iraq, and the PLO supported Iraq. The PLO had always gotten a lot of support from Saddam Hussein. They didn't quite know what to do. There were quite a large number of Palestinians also in Kuwait. So the PLO supported Saddam Hussein. So after the war ended, Yasser Arafat was really left out on the end of a rather long and very skinny limb and decided that he would have to make concessions to the Israelis. Around 400,000 Palestinians were expelled from Kuwait at that time, so this created a big problem for him. So this, over a period of time, led to the Oslo Accords, which of course were signed under Clinton, but this is when the stage was really set for these sorts of developments. Now, most of these were, of course, unintended consequences. I don't think anybody saw at the time that these things were likely to happen, but it really altered the entire dynamics in the Middle East. My memory is that at the end of the Gulf War, those of us who studied the Middle East, and most Middle East experts, were very optimistic. We really thought that there had been a change in the dynamics of the alliances in the Middle East, that the fact that Syria supported the American side, hostages in Lebanon were released. Iran remained neutral. They said they were obviously not in favor of Iraq invading Kuwait, but they were not in favor of the American invasion either, and their position is that both sides would go home. But Iran offered to mediate some sort of solution. President Bush turned it down, but it was the first time that Iran had made any kind of overtures toward the United States. So it really looked as though the Middle East was going to reshape itself and that we would have a more optimistic period of time. I just want to add one more little note about that, and that would be the imposition of sanctions. And this is something that I can't say we would blame it on the American side, on President Bush, because the UN imposed the sanctions, but we were in favor of them. And most of them, of course, were carried out and executed under President Clinton. But the Bush administration was very much in favor of sanctions, and the consequences of sanctions were that, one, it was devastating for Iraq. And when the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, we discovered a lot that we didn't know about the impact of sanctions on the Iraqi infrastructure. And they were very controversial within the United States, if some of you remember. I remember that Madeleine Albright came to speak at Wesleyan, where I was teaching at the time. And there was such a huge protest. This is early days of being able to convene huge protests. Students came from colleges all around, and we had to sneak her through underground tunnels to get her from the president's house to the stage. It was that controversial. It was a really beginning of a massive protest sort of era. So all that got its start, too, in the aftermath of that war, which was enormously consequential. Well, let me stop on that note, too, so that we have some time for questions from the audience, and I will let you moderate.
Well, that was wonderful. I'm just going to let me say one thing, which is less about George H.W. Bush, the person or the president, but the time period that it encapsulates and how, to some degree, it shaped everything afterwards. I think that, after the Second World War, the United States, essentially to address the root causes of the first two world wars, constructed what we now call the liberal international order, right? The institutions, the alliances, the deployments of U.S. forces, the norms, the rules that we associate with the liberal international order. But institutions like the United Nations, the NATO alliance, the World Bank, the IMF, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which became the WTO, the enduring presence of American forces overseas, the alliance network in Asia, the rebuilding of Germany and Japan, the Marshall Plan, and blah, 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 blah. But that liberal, what some political scientists have called that liberal hegemonic project, always sat astride the realities of geopolitics during the Cold War, which was where we didn't always lean forward with our values, where we had to deal with an ideological and military competitor on a global scale. The end of the Cold War raised a question for American policymakers about whether those institutions we had erected during the Cold War should be modified and abandoned, or whether they should be adapted and extended. And the George H.W. Bush administration made the very conscious decision to use the institutions of the post-World War II period to extend that liberal hegemonic project, the New World Order. And what was interesting is, it did so in an extraordinarily successful way. And yet, George H.W. Bush was a one-term president. Why? Because Bill Clinton beat him in an election where it was the economy stupid. And I think there's a lesson in that, which is that if you look back at the specific set of circumstances that allowed the United States to launch this project at the end of the Second World War, two permissive conditions were there. One, the U.S. economy was booming and levels of inequality were at their lowest levels in American history. And two, we faced an existential danger from the Soviet Union. And I think what you saw at the end of George H.W. Bush's presidency is that it was increasingly difficult for American presidents to make the case that the United States should be deeply engaged with the rest of the world. And we were at the front edge of what we now think of as globalization and the types of dislocations that was creating in the American economy and the temptations that has created and pressures from the American public to pull back. And what you've seen in every president since George H.W. Bush has been an attempt to try to craft a vision to justify continued deep engagement with the rest of the world. And every president has struggled to make that case. And we are now very much living with the consequences of not making that case. So anyway, I don't want to put all of that on George H.W. Bush, but it is interesting that such a successful foreign policy president was a one-term president, because people didn't care about those things ultimately when it came to re-electing him. All right, with that, I now open it all up to you. We have about 45 minutes for back and forth. Harold? And if you could introduce I know who Harold is, obviously, but if you could introduce yourself so that everybody up here, and more importantly here, knows who you are. Go ahead.
So Harold McGinnis, Deputy Director of CSAC. More by way of comment than question, sorry about that. But I do want to note that it's interesting how you frame this as a sort of a turning point in sort of the liberal international order in U.S. foreign policy. And if we look at other regions around the world, we also see that really very consequential impact of the Bush presidency. For example, in Latin America, this is the period from which you go from the invasion of Panama to really the Central American peace agreement. So the Bush's decision to end the Cold War in Central America, to help bring about peace, to foster democracy, work with democratic states across the region in a way that the Reagan administration had only just begun to do, and even the very conscious decision in Panama to really focus on building a democracy there, kind of laid the groundwork for a very different pattern of U.S.-Latin American relations, which went from being sort of imposition to more of a partnership. So, this vision extends beyond sort of Europe and the Middle East. I think it really is sort of, you can see the extension of that liberal international order come to sort of Latin America.
Great. François Yelmoin, Nuclear Security Leading Fellow here at CSAC. I have a question. So from David, we heard that there was the assumption that the unification of Germany within NATO was something very important for the stability of Europe. I want to hear maybe why was that actually? If the Soviet Union was falling apart, the main existential threat was also falling apart for the US. So why was it so important to get involved in trying to get reunified Germany within NATO?
Well, the two aspects Oh, sorry. Two aspects. One, why important to have Germany reunified, and the second, why to have it in NATO, right? Well, the first is the dynamic internally in Germany was towards reunification. And it was Kohl who wanted to see reunification. The elections in East Germany in early 1990 showed support for reunification. I mean, you would have to have, I mean, it's possible the US and Moscow and Washington could have said, we're not going to have a reunified Germany, but it would have been a very difficult policy to impose, especially since on both sides, at least the official language was always, yes, the goal is reunification. It's even if people thought that might be way in the future. So the second point, so I think there were dangers if that process was not, as it were, managed externally and internally in the two Germanys, and if there were dangers if it wasn't done quickly, because then there could be kind of arguments about the nature of the reunification and so on. At least that, I think, is how Kohl saw it, and that's how the Bush administration backed him up. I mean, President Mitterrand was not so happy with the idea, and Mrs. Thatcher, of course, was notoriously against reunification. And of course, the Soviet Union, at least Gorbachev accepted it, but there were a lot of people around him who were very unhappy about the way in which he acquiesced in the reunification, especially reunification within NATO. And that's, I think, is just part of the US policy was, I mean, one way to put it is the way that Colin just put it, right? We have these successful institutions. Now we have a chance to spread them to, you know, a new part of the world, because the Soviet order has broken down. And so we want to be still in Europe. NATO, the most successful alliance in history, as it was often billed, should extend. And yes, that will provide for German security. And a Germany embedded in NATO is safer than a Germany outside NATO. And Kohl, after all, was doing things to try to reassure Europeans that Germany would not be a threat. We owe the euro to his attempt to satisfy people, you know, at least to reassure people about Germany's role. So I think on both of those counts, of course, you know, not every stability in politics isn't a totally objective criterion, but I think certainly from the Western point of view and from a European point of view, Germany reunified and in NATO was seen as the best option.
Colin, you talked, it was kind of a quick thing that you said about at the end of World War II, the United States faced an existential threat from the Soviet Union. I'd like you to go back to that. Is that clear cut?
Yes,
or were there any options?
I would put it this way. I think one could debate whether that was objectively true, and honestly, David Holloway would be better suited than me. Obviously, there are different traditions in history about where to put the blame for the Cold War and how much of it was rooted in Soviet ideology and ambition and how much of it was rooted in a reaction of the Soviet Union to a set of policies the United States put in place. There are other explanations as well. I don't know that you have to adjudicate that, though, to come to the point that from the perspective of the American foreign policy establishment, by the late 1940s, certainly by the time the Soviets exploded their first nuclear device in 1949, and then you get the war on the Korean Peninsula and the loss of China and all the rest, that a consensus solidifies that the Soviet Union, specifically in international communism more broadly, poses an existential threat to us both militarily and ideologically, to our way of life. And the point that I was making was that actually the liberal hegemonic project didn't start out as being about the Soviet Union. It actually started off, I mean, you can root it in Woodrow Wilson's ambitions in World War I or in the Atlantic Charter in 1941, but in either case, it was about a set of policy prescriptions and institutions that were meant to address the root causes of what they thought were the root causes of the two world wars: militarism, authoritarianism, inequality, colonialism, imperialism, go down the list. But it was that project got layered on top of it, the containment project. And the point that I was making was that it wasn't really until the 1950s that you see American public opinion swinging behind the types of enduring and costly investments in U.S. leadership that we now assume are part of the indispensable role the United States plays in the world stage. And it would be hard to imagine the American public having bought into that project had the U.S. economy not been where it was, had the middle class not been where it was, had inequality not been so low, and had there not been this general perception, objectively true or not, of this existential danger. And the point that and obviously this is not a discussion about Truman or Eisenhower, it's a discussion about George H.W. Bush. But what's so interesting about George H.W. Bush is that you have the first post-Cold War attempt to craft a justification for continued deep American engagement in the rest of the world in the absence of this existential danger, and it falls flat. And it falls flat precisely because the United States, the American public, is more focused on our internal dynamics and our own economic malaise, and therefore George H.W. Bush loses. And there's something in that, I think, of someone who was extraordinarily successful as a foreign policy president and set the stage for so much of what would follow in the post-Cold War foreign policy tradition, who gets defeated at the ballot box fundamentally because of the economy. Yeah, please, of course.
Let me add a personal comment. Since I took you back to Los Alamos directorship, let me take you back to growing up in Austria after the war. So at that point, as I was born in '43, in 1953, I grew up in Austria. In 1953, I remember going to Vienna to a camp. So I was 10 years old. And as you know, Austria was divided up into 4 zones, and Vienna itself was divided into 4 zones. We happened to go into the Soviet zone, although in Austria we didn't call them Soviets, we just called them Russians. And indeed, while I was growing up, I mean, whatever threat that we perceived in Austria, it was the Russian threat. So I don't know about the geopolitics and whether that threat was real or not, but growing up in Austria, even as independent as it was, and I never did understand, because I left Austria for the United States in '56. In '55, as you know, the Soviets pulled out of Austria. To me at that time, that was quite a puzzle. But nevertheless, sort of growing up inside of Europe, there was no question that we viewed the Russians.
There was a lot of discussion. My name is Colin Kahl. There was a lot of discussion about the fact that Bush was a one-term president who was enormously successful in his one term. So, to engage in a bit of counterfactual history, if Bush was elected for the second term, what would be different from Clinton's first term? What would he do differently than Clinton did?
I'm going to leave that to the historian.
If Napoleon had a B-52, would Waterloo have turned out differently? Yeah, please. Yeah.
Slightly different question about trying to get what defines success? Is it the events you live in, or did he do something? So ask the other counterfactual. What if Clinton had been president in 1988? Like everybody's been assigning he was incredibly successful, but what if you just switched out a guy with 0 foreign policy experience? Would history have been different? Sorry to pile on.
Well, historians tend not to like counterfactuals very much, and I think I've been presented with 3. So I think if you go back, I think one of the striking things about the Bush administration was that it really still kept to a Cold War view of the world in the early months. It really was quite late, frankly, to kind of say, we can build on what has happened between Reagan and Gorbachev. There was, I think, a real uncertainty about what, the vision thing was missing. you can say I don't say that as a real criticism, but I think it's true, and I think therefore the easy option, in a way, was to say we have these institutions, let's expand them, let's move them, and the conditions were right for doing that. The Warsaw Pact wasn't going to survive, even if Gorbachev was saying, let's have Germany in the Warsaw Pact as well as in NATO. The members of the Warsaw Pact wanted to get out from under that as quickly as possible. I mean, except for the Soviet Union. What if I think that I think what if Reagan had a third term? Just to introduce another counterfactual one. I think in those early months of '89, there might have been more willingness to ease trade restrictions to help Gorbachev earlier, and that might have made a difference, I think. Clinton coming in, somebody who didn't have foreign policy experience, that's very hard to know. But he might have engaged more quickly with Gorbachev than Bush did. I mean, Bush, of course, knew Gorbachev. He, after all, been vice president for 2 terms. But it's really surprising. It's not till December of the year that they actually meet. And so if we're telling personal stories, I had a chance to brief Bush in November '89, after the few days after the opening of the wall. There were 3 of us called in to the Oval Office. It was Condi Rice who arranged it. And we had an hour with him and Baker and Cheney and Scowcroft. And it was not to discuss what they should do at Malta, because clearly they had decided. But it was apparently, Condi explained, to try to give Bush more insights into what was going on in the Soviet Union. So it was Arnold, Horlick, Steve Meyer, and myself in the session I was in. And that, in a way, when I look back on it, it's interesting that they felt the need to do that. Of course, things were changing rapidly, and probably maybe any president would have wanted, some kind of new or different outside kind of interpretation of what was happening. I think it was a very difficult time. Assumptions were being swept aside, and it was very, I think, disconcerting to not to be sure, well, how do you proceed? I think they proceeded with the assumptions they had. I think that had consequences, some of which were good and some of which were not good, when we look at it in retrospect. I don't know, Michal, your question was slightly different. What would have been different, if Bush had had a second term? Maybe not that much, because the cooperative threat reduction, which he started, that would have continued, and he backed that. Arms control negotiations would have continued. Would there have been a different policy towards domestic politics, less active in Russia? I don't know. Bush was, on the whole, rather cautious. I think maybe less, what's the word I want, outgoing than Clinton was, and maybe less hooked on the issue of democracy. He was more a realist, I think, and maybe that might have been a bit different. But again, what the consequences of that would have been is another issue.
So just let me make one quick comment on this. I think the more interesting counterfactual question is, what would FDR have done in his 13th term? But no, I do think if you look at the time it took for the Clinton team to get their footing, it took them quite a lot of time. And I think we were fortunate as a country that we had such a seasoned group to go through this transition. So I don't know whether, in counterfactuals, whether it's not a partisan thing, it's just people who had the perspective and the relationships and other things to kind of shepherd us through this. There are some places where I think had Bush beat Clinton, things might have been a little different. I think in many of the places they would have been the same. So David already mentioned arms control. Another big Clinton initiative was the extension of economic globalization through NAFTA and the WTO, both projects that the Bush folks, Bush started NAFTA, they would have supported the WTO. A third major piece of Clinton's foreign policy was the engagement with China, which is certainly something Bush would have done. In fact, you'll recall that Clinton criticized Bush for catering to the butchers of Beijing, right? And then during the campaign, and then pivots towards engagement with China as this rising power. I think the main place where you might have seen difference is, my sense is that seeing how Somalia went south, I'm not convinced another Bush administration would have been as gung-ho on a humanitarian intervention as ultimately the Clinton administration became, as they tried to hook the argument for deep American leadership around this kind of moralistic argument. I don't see Bush at least making that rhetorical move. Whether he would have intervened in the Balkans or not eventually, I don't know. It is Europe after all. The last point, which is an interesting one, is how Bush might have approached NATO enlargement differently. I think that for the Clinton administration, they really saw NATO enlargement not only as essentially a way to extend the community of democracies. And I find it hard to believe that Bush would have been attracted to that rationale for NATO enlargement. I also think he might have been more sensitive to Russian anxieties about NATO enlargement. And if that's true, that he would have taken a more cautious approach on NATO enlargement, then that might have actually been a quite consequential difference, given that there's big debates about whether Putin and much of Russian nationalism now just uses that as an excuse, or it's actually part and parcel of the explanation for why the Russians felt cornered. But nevertheless, I think that I would say the humanitarian intervention piece and the NATO enlargement piece might be the areas that you would have seen the greatest divergence.
Colin, can I
please.
add,
Please,
add
yes.
a
And then we'll
few
go back here.
comments?
Go ahead.
In relation to Clinton instead of Bush, I would say that Clinton would have had a more difficult time in the nuclear arena than what Bush did. Again, being the Republican, for example, that phone call, from Bush to Gorbachev, I would see that Clinton would have had enormously heavy criticism to go and take unilateral actions to take nuclear weapons away. He would have just, because there was still so much skepticism in Washington about Russia, as you well know, at the time. So he would have had more difficult time. Also, even when it came to the TTBT, the vote on the TTBT, the ratification vote, 98-0. 98-0. So somehow Bush was able to pull that off. On the other hand, though, Mikhail's question related to suppose Bush would have had a second term. I actually think that the cooperative threat reduction might have gone slower under Bush, because in the end he was so cautious in all of that. And even though he helped to get things started and signed that legislation in December of 1991, but there were people in his administration that were against that. And Bill Perry will tell you in 1992, not much happened. And even in our lab-to-lab, when I came back from Russia with all of these proposals of what we could do together, I was told to stick to the fundamental science. Don't do the nuclear weapons safety, don't do the nuclear weapons security. So there was still a lot of caution and skepticism, and it really didn't take off until 1993. Bill Perry came in and company.
Can I add something?
Yes, you can, of course, and then we'll go back.
So I'll be very brief. I think in general in the Middle East, the Bush foreign policy elite supported the Clinton hardline toward Iraq. I don't think there was any. It could be they would not have taken any risks for the Palestinians, if that fits along the sort of the humanitarian intervention, more moralistic, if we can use that term, side of Clinton. But David's story about going in to talk to Bush reminded me of a story that was told by Samuel Lewis, who had been the U.S. ambassador to Israel, subsequently the head of the U.S. Institute of Peace. So Bush, before the invasion, pushing Iraq out of Kuwait, did call in some Middle East experts to talk to them about it. He was a cautious person. He did try to seek advice, so he called in a bunch of Middle East experts, and they were given an hour with the president, an entire hour of the president's time. Really significant thing. And what did they do? They all set to arguing with each other. For the whole hour, they argued with each other. Finally, they were courteously ushered out, and the president turned to Scowcroft and he said, "What was that about?" And of course, there's no consensus among any elite as to what to do about the Middle East. And so he was a victim of those sorts of disagreements.
That's great. Sidra, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I did. Sidra Hamidi, Stanton Security Fellow. So I'm wondering what the considerations of George H.W. Bush's legacy say about our current historical moment, because there's a lot that's been made of, like David brought attention to, this notion of civility, which seems very much related to sort of comparing to the Trump administration. So I'm just wondering if you've thought a little bit about what it says about our current historical moment, that we're sort of going through this moment of considering what George H.W. Bush meant, both to foreign policy, but in general, in an American history sense.
Well, of course, one of the things that's been very striking over the last week or 10 days is how much of the praise for George Bush is really criticism of Donald Trump. And not very subtly, well, subtly enough, maybe, but not so subtle. It won't be understood. No, I've thought about it because it comes back to the point that Colin was making, that the end of the Cold War was a kind of break for US foreign policy. I mean, it's the collapse of the Soviet attempt to create its own international order, and it gives a big boost to globalization, in fact, because you've more economies, more states being brought into the global economy and wanting to be part of the global economy. I think the NATO indeed did adjust and did adapt. Force levels in Europe are made very different. And in a way now, when I think especially of let's say European security, which is what I was talking about, we are now, I think, in a bad way, both in terms of relations between Europe and the US, and in terms of relations within Europe itself, in the European Union, and also in relations between Russia and the rest of Europe. I continue to count Russia as part of Europe. And I think to some degree, as I tried to hint, these were questions that were left unsolved by the Bush policy, even though I think as I said, the reunification of Germany was important and skillfully done. Nevertheless, there wasn't a security architecture created that embraced Russia and the rest of Europe. Not even to say that an architecture that worked, that was even rejected as a way of thinking about it, and maybe rightly. I'm not claiming that this was necessarily a wrong decision, because the wishes of these European states had to be taken into account. One couldn't just say, well, let Russia and the US sort out all the problems. So I think we are at maybe a turning point, not as dramatic, but maybe some kind of aftershock of the end of the Cold War, and the kind of Europe whole and free is only partially true, and the idea of everyone looking to the US is no longer true, because we have Russia and China not only attempting to create a multipolar world, but claiming that the Nuclear Posture Review, with its talk of a revival of great power rivalry, is acknowledging that we're in a multipolar world. And so I think we are at a kind of turning point where the whole debate about what should the US relationship with the rest of the world be, what are the threats, what are the areas in which we should cooperate with other countries, those all seem to be up for issue as well.
But Sidra, I think one point you raised, which is really important, is this is now the second instant in a few months, right? John McCain's funeral was, and look, two people could not have been more, they were both Republicans, but John McCain and George H.W. Bush were not the same type of Republican. They did not have the same temperament. They did not see American foreign policy through the same lens. I think, George H.W. Bush, very much kind of a classical realist and pragmatist. John McCain, essentially a neoconservative. But they were both honored in Washington because of what they symbolized, their passion, their commitment to a particular set of values, their integrity. And the deaths of both men were taken as occasions to draw a contrast between these great, in this case, these great men and the current occupant of the Oval Office. And whether one likes Trump or doesn't like Trump, it's objectively true that he is different from every other president in American history, certainly in the modern age, and is an aberration of sorts to a whole host of norms, traditions, and other things. What's an open question is it a one-off, or is he the symptom of this break? And I think that there are many things about Trump's personality and temperament that incline me to believe we're probably not going to have a president like him anytime soon. But the types of ideas that he embraces, I think that's a more questionable, the nativism, the populism, the nationalism, the inward focus. I'm not the disdain for allies and other things. I think that's an open question, and I think what people were not only drawing the distinction between H.W. Bush and Trump on the civility question, that was real, but I think just along every dimension, Bush was an extraordinarily cautious man. He was an extraordinarily deliberate man. Some would say too cautious. Some would say too deliberate. But he was extraordinarily experienced and educated about the world. And when he didn't have the knowledge, he was willing to reach out to experts and learn more, and surrounded himself with people who were experts. And he was conscious about the need to run American power, as extraordinary as it is, through international institutions, through multilateral arrangements where possible, and to always team up with our allies to confront common challenges. And across all of those dimensions, the current president is very different, right? And so I think that's why. But I think this is going to continue to happen as long as Trump is president. Every single time somebody dies, the obituary will be 60% about them and 40% about the current occupant in the Oval Office, because these events become these national moments for reflection about who we are, what we honor, what we stand for, what we think makes somebody a great person, and so I think it's inevitable.
Let me add.
Yeah, please, and then we'll go back here to it. Go ahead.
The sharing of the microphone. We only have one among the three of us. So when I was sort of trying to assemble some remarks, I thought about that. I thought, what would Trump do if he had another Iraqi invasion of Kuwait going back in the time period? And at first I thought he wouldn't do anything because he doesn't really care about principles of non-aggression. On the other hand, I thought probably he would act because we're very friendly to Saudi Arabia, so he would have done it out of loyalty to Saudi Arabia. But it's hard to imagine the framing of it where the Bush administration kind of sought around for a rationale. Sometimes he said oil, he said different things, but still the stated rationale was the principle of non-aggression. This will not stand, he said. And he said, it's not a threat, it's not a boast. Imagine that, it's not a boast. Just that we're not going to stand this and we're going to push them out. And so he projected this image of sort of a quiet determination that I think at that moment in American history resonated quite well. And as Colin points out, it was sort of ironic then that we're portraying him as someone who did so well and yet he was not reelected. But votes are not cast on grounds of foreign policy. That's known throughout post-war history. And one other thing about Bush that, again, it was stressed again and again, he was a veteran of the Second World War, almost lost his life. His buddies lost their lives, in front of his eyes. So he had, I think, a much deeper sense of the consequences of the use of force. And again, I think that undergirded that kind of determination and a sense that everybody had, that even though sometimes he was mocked for his clumsiness, for his lack of articulateness, that he was a very honest and direct sort of person.
Yeah, I mean, I think Trump would have liberated Kuwait for a 10% cut on Kuwaiti oil sales going forward, and he might not have left southern Iraq either. Go ahead, sir.
I was on Capitol Hill for a number of years, working on non-proliferation issues, among other things. And my tenure there coincided with Jimmy Carter's presidency, Ronald Reagan's presidency, George Bush's presidency. So I had an opportunity to see from that perspective what these people were doing. And so I find the questions about counterfactuals with trying to put other presidents in or switching sides or whatever, kind of interesting. But what nobody has mentioned is the effect of the CIA experience on George Bush, and whether the fact that, from the CIA's point of view, from the foreign policy elite's point of view, the Cold War was the monster in the room every time an important policy decision was being made in foreign policy. And the other side of that is that it meant that there would be continuity among the different presidents, despite whether they're Democrat or Republican. For example, in my view, the failure of American foreign policy in South Asia was allowing Pakistan free rein to get the bomb. And that happened because of a decision that was made during Jimmy Carter's presidency, toward the end of it, all through Ronald Reagan's presidency, the support of the Mujahideen, and until Bush came along, and finally, because of the Pressler Amendment, the United States cut off support for Pakistan because they had built the bomb, and we knew it. We knew it actually when Reagan was president. By the time 1987 came along, Pakistan already had the bomb. We could have cut them off then, we didn't. We could have cut them off before because of other things they were doing that were illegal under American law. So the point I'm trying to make is that all this idea of trying to say, well, if Clinton had been in, or if at a certain time, or Bush had been in a certain time, it would have made a big difference. I don't think so. I mean, some important issues, like non-proliferation, it would not have made any difference because they all shared the same idea about the U.S. view, the U.S. position in the world vis-a-vis the Soviet Union at the time, and therefore they would all have made the same decision. There might have been other politicians who might have made other decisions. They weren't president. So I think that in order to really understand George H.W. Bush's role in terms of foreign policy, you really need to look at the bigger picture. Where did he fit in with respect to the foreign policy elite? Where did he fit in with respect to the people who came out of the CIA? Where did he come in? Where did he stand with respect to his class in terms of decisions being made in foreign policy?
Others? Sir.
So I was thinking about Tom Burson of CSAC. I was thinking about Bush and his legacy and wondering about his legacy before he became president, what he knew about the Soviet Union, what his attitudes were toward this great global threat that the U.S. faced, the existential threat that spun up Colin's set of institutions. He would have been fully aware and alive during McCarthyism. And in fact, Prescott Bush was one of the people who participated and maybe even led the censorship of Joseph McCarthy in 1954. Any information at all about what this Bush finished or felt required to do because of his father's work.
Anything about the past is obviously something that an historian can answer.
I don't know the answer to that question. I'd come back to Len's point, sorry. Because, yeah.
Good try, Tom.
Because Bush, no, absolutely. The Soviet Union was the main threat. The nature of the threat changed, or the way in which we viewed the threat changed. It lost some of its ideological force by the 1970s and 80s, but by that time the Soviet Union had built up a vast nuclear forces, and that was seen as a danger. I mean, this was, the Committee on the Present Danger, formed in the mid-70s, was to focus on Soviet thinking about nuclear weapons and the nuclear threat, the strategic nuclear threat coming from the Soviet Union. So Bush was very much in that. When he was director of the CIA, he allowed the Team B exercise to take place with outside critics coming in to, led by Richard Pipes, to say that the CIA was was underestimating the Soviet threat. And but what's puzzling to me in a way is when you ask that question, then what about the experience of the Reagan administration? I mean, there he is, very close to Ronald Reagan. Reagan is, has switched in important ways, not only on he's come out, as it were, on nuclear weapons to be an abolitionist, but he has also bonded in a very important way with Gorbachev. So, and they were getting, that was at the center of Reagan's foreign policy. So where was Bush in all of that? That when he comes in, he stands back and says, no, we need to rethink this. And, he had his press secretary, was it Marvin, I've forgotten his name, Fitzwater, right, say, Bush is like some cigar store Indian or something. I mean, some totally dismissive remark. And so that's the puzzle to me, is actually not in the 50s, it's what did he really take out of the experience of working with Reagan? What looked to him so wrong when he was very close to what was going on?
What was he doing during that time between when he came to office and when he finally engaged with the Soviets?
Well, no, they did establish an assessment of policy, which didn't produce anything very new as far as I'm aware, and lasted certainly till May or June. Then, of course, things began to happen in Eastern Europe. He did go to Poland and so on, but the meeting with Gorbachev was kind of put off, though lots of people were saying, why don't you take this up? He'd met Gorbachev. It wasn't as though this was something new. So he, I think, was being very cautious. They were putting out rumors, or some people in the Bush administration were putting out rumors that Schultz was one of the weakest secretaries of state we'd ever had, that Reagan had just gone overboard on giving away too much, and at the INF was a bad treaty, and what did Gorbachev's speech at the UN really mean? So there was caution, and you can explain it in different ways. One is just difficulty of changing your strongly held views. A second is that, yes, there was a lot of uncertainty. It wasn't all plain sailing. We didn't know exactly early in 89, or at the end of 88, early 89, how things would happen, right? We had the talk of the Sinatra doctrine instead of the Brezhnev doctrine. But, when the chips were down, what would really happen? That was not clear, I think. So, I'm trying to make the case for the caution here. It's not crazy. It's just, but that was the reaction, and then you wonder, well, how was he thinking about what was going on under Reagan?
All right. So our last point right here. This will be the last question, unfortunately. So go ahead. Please introduce yourself.
Rob Rakove, diplomatic historian. When we look at the Bush presidency, we tend to concentrate on the first half of it. I think it's where the major cases are, and it's where historians have focused to date. Thinking back to my own fragmentary memories of '92, I think foreign policy wasn't working very well for him because he'd sustained a number of blows on that front. In the wake of the Gulf War, we had footage of suffering Kurds and Shiites, we had footage out of Yugoslavia, and we had the whole charge that he was coddling China. And some of this was unfair and related to the nature of the campaign, but I think some of this also related to how he promoted expectations and raised them and not fulfilled them in fundamental ways. I think Yugoslavia ran afoul of the New World Order he was offering. And having likened Saddam Hussein to Hitler, he was then in a position of explaining why we were not finishing the job. I mean, this may have been a fundamental flaw in his policy, that he'd kind of dial up the rhetoric to 10 or 11, if you take the reference, and then not actually quite be able to meet it. And if there's time for an answer, I'm thinking back to Somalia, which is for me the strange sore thumb in his foreign policy. Did the Bush we know take a holiday and someone else sort of fill in his place, or is Somalia somehow consistent with Bush's foreign policy? Because it seems very odd alongside everything else.
So on that last point, I mean, I think Somalia is anomalous and is only a byproduct of the political pressure the administration came under because of the images of suffering and the way that they presented that operation as essentially not, I mean, it was a military operation in the sense that we sent the armed forces in, but it was not described as one in which there was any possibility that the military would get involved in an actual conflict. They were literally just going to be there to deliver food to starving babies. I do think the whole host of things, what you're starting to see by 1992 is that in the messy aftermath of the Gulf War, and then as things become more chaotic in the former Soviet space, and you get Somalia, is actually a problem that then the Clinton administration struggles with too, which is exactly how to describe the challenges the United States faces in an international environment in which the Soviet Union is not there. People can't even agree on what the right frame is, right? So is it the end of history? Is it the clash of civilizations? Is it the coming anarchy? Is it something else? These are all, you know, and I think we start to see that in the last period of the Bush administration about how to justify the use of American power in a bunch of circumstances in which America's vital interests actually aren't at stake. Our values might be at stake, and some of our second or third tier interests might be at stake, but our vital interests really aren't at stake. And how to shape a narrative around justifying why the United States needs to continue to be militarily engaged all over the world in the absence of this challenge. And Bush didn't solve that riddle and was plagued by the incoherence of the 1992, basically the second half of 91 through 1992, and that same problem bedevils Clinton the entire time that he's president. The only president who temporarily fixed that problem was George W. Bush for about 18 months after 9/11, when there was this rally around this particular frame and this lust for vengeance. But even that faded as the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq went back, and George W. Bush struggled for the rest of his presidency to justify America's commitment. And the president I worked for, Barack Obama, never stumbled on a frame to legitimize deep engagement either. So that was the point that I was making about how George H.W. Bush was really the first president to have to struggle with what the end of the Cold War meant for American foreign policy, and nobody succeeded at doing it. And American foreign policy elites still struggle with that at the moment, which is why there's such a dissonance between how Republicans and Democratic internationalists talk about the world and how our current president and his supporters talk about the world. All right, well, thank you everybody very much. Thank you to the panelists.